This incredible story took place in Canada. When Sean was returning home after a successful day of fishing, he decided to take a shortcut through the bushes instead of his usual route. At that moment, he experienced the greatest shock of his life. He had only stepped a few meters off the trail when suddenly a huge black bear appeared right in front of him. The bear was so close that he could see its nose twitching as it breathed. The man tried to remain calm and act as he had been taught. He raised his hands and made himself look bigger to appear more intimidating and less like potential prey. The bear stood on its hind legs and sniffed him. It was really threateningly close. It was terrifying, but then the bear sat down and began to whimper. At first, he stepped back, ready to retreat. But its painful whines made him turn around. He noticed that the bear had several cuts on its side. Its front paw also appeared to be injured. This could make the situation even more dangerous. However, the bear did not pose a threat. Instead, it looked simply distressed. Sean remembered the early morning. Across the river, a mother bear was walking with her cub. This was likely the same bear. But what had happened that caused it to be injured? And where was the cub? This thought immediately prompted Sean to act. He realized that the bear was asking for his help and cautiously followed the animal to the river. Upon reaching the river, Sean frantically searched for the cub, while the mother bear was still accompanying him. But he did not see any cubs. This was strange, and suddenly, a dark head appeared from the water. Sean focused his gaze on that spot. Indeed, the cub's head popped up again, as if it was clinging to a rock. Water was flowing over the cub. It wouldn't be able to hold on much longer. Sean suspected that the mother bear had been trying in vain to save her cub and had gotten injured in the process. Realizing that she couldn't do it alone, she had come for help and found Sean. Sean couldn't let the cub drown right before his eyes. But he knew from personal experience how strong and dangerous the current was in that part of the river. Jumping in unprepared would be a life-threatening mistake. He had to come up with a plan. He quickly grabbed his fishing gear and the rope he usually used for catching fish. He securely tied the rope around his waist and left a long piece lying in front of him. He then firmly tied the other end of the rope to a tree on the riverbank. Then he decisively jumped into the water. The current turned out to be even stronger than he had feared. With all his might, Sean fought his way to the rocks where he had last seen the cub. Sean's experience as a former Navy SEAL served him well, as an inexperienced swimmer might not have survived in such turbulent waters. He reached the rocks and paused to see exactly where the cub was. For a moment, all he could hear was the growling and whimpering of the mother bear on the shore, who was pacing back and forth in desperation and clearly worried. But she seemed to understand that it was too dangerous to dive back into the rushing water. All her hope of seeing her cub again now rested on this unusual man. Sean was breathing heavily and was confused. The turbulent tide and constant flooding made it difficult for him to pinpoint the exact location of the cub. He was overjoyed when he saw the cub's head in front of him. To reach the cub, he would only have to swim further downstream. But then, in a tragic moment, the cub lost its grip on the rocks and was swept away by the river. Its head disappeared into the dark water in an instant. Without hesitation, Sean jumped after it and swam with all his strength. If he lost the cub at that moment, it might be lost forever. The little cub went underwater and seemed to stop struggling. The situation looked dire, but Sean fought desperately and swam after the bear. But the rope he had tied around his waist was getting tighter and finally reached the end of its length. When the cub's head appeared again, he grabbed it just in time. He was afraid the cub would struggle or scratch him. But the bear just lay limply in his arms. But that was not the end. Now it was time to return to the safety of the shore. Sean knew that he would need both hands to swim back. He grabbed the piece of rope he had previously thrown aside and tied it around the cub. Now Sean could use all his strength to get it to safety. It helped that the cub was motionless, but at the same time, this was a significant problem. It might already be too late to save the cub's life. What would happen if he reached the mother bear with a lifeless cub? This could have unimaginable consequences for Sean. But at that moment, he couldn't focus on that. All his energy had to be directed toward getting the cub to safety. He felt his strength draining away. Only adrenaline was propelling him forward. Suddenly, his feet touched the ground. They had reached shallow water. Sean was able to pick up the cub and pull it out of the water. The mother bear was approaching them at a dizzying speed. She was surprisingly fast for such an injured animal. Sean knew he had to untie the rope from the cub before the bear reached them. He didn't even have time to glance at the cub before the mother bear grabbed it. However, as the bear took a few steps toward the forest, it suddenly began to sway dangerously. The next moment, it fell to the ground with a thud. The cub crawled over to it, but she didn't move. Sean rushed closer to see what the problem was. Only then did he realize that the cuts must have been worse than he had assumed. Apparently, the adrenaline in her body had kept her going. And now that her cub was alive and safe, she had completely collapsed. Sean couldn't believe it. He had saved the cub only to see it become orphaned before his eyes. He felt helpless. There he had no cell phone reception, and he didn't have enough time to get home. In that hopeless moment, something unexpected happened. Suddenly, he heard something in the distance. It sounded like a pickup truck. He shouted loudly, and suddenly he was surrounded by several forest rangers. Some tourists who had previously seen him rescue the cub in the river hurried to leave the woods before they were met. They then alerted the rangers, who arrived on the scene as quickly as possible. They had a large crate with them, and since the mother bear was still unresponsive, they were able to take care of her safely. They bandaged her wounds to stop the bleeding and then carefully loaded her into the crate. The rescue team took both bears to the nearest wildlife clinic, where they received professional care. People hoped to save the bear's life. Without them, rehabilitating the cub would have been difficult. That same day, the mother had to undergo surgery. Some of her wounds had even developed an infection. The cub was still very weak after the life-threatening experience, so they calmed it down so it could rest and recover. The efforts to restore the mother's health were intense, but the presence of her cub seemed to give her the strength she needed to recover. Fortunately, both animals eventually healed, and finally, the day came when they were to return to their true home, the forest. The rescue team devised a release plan and informed Sean about it. They met at the release site further in the woods. The moment the cage doors opened was magical. The mother bear immediately ran toward the forest. The cub hesitated for a moment, looked at its mother, and then followed her into freedom. Sean could barely hold back his tears. He was proud to have saved the little family, although he felt a bit sad that he would probably never see them again.